I'd been a park ranger for nearly 4 years. The other rangers always had some story to tell about their encounters with some monstrous creatures lurking in the dark. You'd have thought we were living in some fantasy novel with the creatures they described. The stories were amusing, but that's all they were to me, until they were suddenly something more. One evening, just as the sun had set, I was heading back to the station after a long day. The crickets were just starting their symphony, and the headlights of my old pickup were the only things tearing through the dark. That's when I saw it, right there on the edge of the dirt road. Something massive, crouched on two legs. The initial thought that rushed into my mind was, bear. It was the only logical explanation. But as my truck crawled closer and the headlights bathed the area in a harsh light, it was clear as day that this wasn't a bear. It was tall and lean and covered in pitch-black fur, more humanoid than animal. Its limbs were long and sinewy, unlike the thick, muscular legs of a bear. It was not on all fours as a bear might have been. Instead, it sat as a man would, casually observing the surroundings. Legends, I muttered to myself, remembering the stories my colleagues would tell. Had I just become part of one of those tales? The whole scenario felt surreal, like a dream you couldn't wake up from, no matter how hard you tried. The dark figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just sat there, a haunting silhouette under the stars. In my years as a park ranger, I'd learned that the wilderness had its own language. It spoke through the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, the gentle gurgling of a stream. But this was something entirely different. This was a language that I'd never heard before, a language of fear, uncertainty, and raw primal power. It was in that moment I realized that the legends I'd been hearing all these years weren't just stories to amuse or scare. They were warnings, whispers of something strange and primal that walked our lands, something we didn't understand and couldn't control. From that night on, my perception of the park changed, as did my perception of the stories shared around the station. My reality had shifted. The lines between fiction and fact were blurred. And as I stared into the eyes of the unknown, a peculiar blend of fear and fascination seized me. I knew then that my job as a park ranger was more than just patrolling and preservation. It was about acknowledging, respecting, and coexisting with the mysteries that our wild, untamed world still held. Just then, something remarkable happened. The creature, the thing, whatever it was, suddenly stood up. A breath caught in my throat as I watched it stretch, reaching a height taller than any man I'd ever seen. Its silhouette stretched long against the backdrop of the dense forest, seemingly merging with the night. I tensed in my seat, every instinct screaming at me to flee. But like a deer caught in the headlights, I remained frozen, my eyes locked on the figure. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale, my breath fogging up the windshield. Slowly, with a grace that belied its size, the creature turned and began to move away, melting into the underbrush as if it was part of the forest itself. It didn't hurry. It didn't even glance back. It just disappeared, as silently as it had appeared. For a moment I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I glanced around, half expecting to see the creature re-emerge from the shadows, but the road was empty, the only sound being the distant hooting of an owl and the rustle of the wind through the trees. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I released my grip on the steering wheel and let out a shaky breath. My pulse was still racing and my mind was reeling, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The tall tales I'd always dismissed, they had become my reality. I'd seen something out there, something that couldn't be explained away, something that had forever changed the way I saw the park and my role in it. As I drove back to the station, the image of the creature, tall and regal, forever imprinted in my mind, I felt a strange sense of humility wash over me. I was a small part of something much larger, much wilder, and much more mysterious than I had ever imagined. From that day forward, my tales joined those of the other rangers, and with every telling I'd feel a shiver of fear, a thrill of respect, and a hint of wonder. For I'd seen the legends with my own eyes, and they were more magnificent and terrifying than any story could ever convey. However, this was not an isolated incident, far from it. In the weeks that followed, whispers of similar sightings began to trickle in from around the park. Hikers reported glimpses of a large black figure moving with an eerie grace through the wilderness. Campers woke up to find their sights disturbed, long footprints embedded deep in the soft soil. The stories varied in details, but were all marked by an underlying sense of wonder and unease. The creature was always described as tall, slender, covered in dark fur with long, spindly limbs. Its presence was always marked by an unusual calm, a palpable sense of being watched, observed. I couldn't help but feel a strange connection to these tales. They echoed my own encounter with the creature, brought back the emotions I'd felt that night. The terror, the fascination, the inexplicable sense of being part of something bigger, more profound. But as the stories piled up, so did my questions. What was this creature? Why was it appearing more frequently? Was it a warning or was it simply curious? I found myself spending more time out in the park, patrolling the trails, scanning the shadows, hoping for another glimpse of the creature. The wilderness had taken on a new layer of mystery, a new sense of anticipation that kept me on edge. And yet, with each passing day, my fear was gradually replaced with a strange sense of kinship. The creature, whatever it was, seemed more of a guardian than a threat. It was as much a part of the park as the towering trees and the rustling wind, as the chirping crickets and the gurgling streams. This newfound understanding didn't lessen the awe or the respect I had for the creature. If anything, it heightened it. It reminded me of the grandeur of nature, of the unknown entities that shared our world, living just out of sight, reminding us of the wildness we often forget in our manicured lives. One thing's for certain. Every night as I drive my pickup down that dirt road, I keep my eyes open and the headlights bright. And every time a large shadow crosses my path, I hold my breath, waiting for a long, spindly limb to emerge from the darkness and a new tale to unfold. Just when I thought I'd experienced my fair share of encounters for the time being, my coworker Brian asked if I would help him clear some brush. Now Brian was an old hand at the ranger station, a grizzled veteran who'd seen it all. Well, almost. His eyes would glaze over whenever we shared our tales around the campfire, but I never caught him contributing to the narratives, not about the creature. "Got a small grove near the West Trail," Brian said one morning, his voice gravelly as always. "Storm took down some trees, needs cleaning up." I agreed, of course. A change of pace was welcome. Besides, working with Brian was always a learning experience. His knowledge of the park, the plants, and animals was encyclopedic. We set off early, the morning air still crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine lingering in the atmosphere. Our axes and chainsaws lay in the bed of Brian's old truck, bouncing with every rut and bump on the dirt road. As we neared the grove, a peculiar sense of familiarity washed over me. I recognized the surroundings, the oddly shaped boulder, the fallen log half submerged in a brook. This was near where I'd first seen the creature. A chill ran down my spine. We got to work, the whirring of chainsaws and the rhythmic thudding of axes echoing through the quiet forest. There was a comforting monotony to the task, a sort of rhythm that lulled you into a state of focused tranquility. Just as we were finishing up, a noise froze me in my tracks, a rustling, far too loud to be a squirrel or a bird. It was that distinct sound of something large moving through the underbrush. I turned to Brian, his eyes wide, his body stiff. He'd heard it too. For a moment we stood there in silence, our breaths hitching in the cool forest air as the rustling grew louder. Then, just as abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. We were no longer alone. Something was watching us, observing us. I knew it. Brian knew it. For a moment we just stood there, our gazes fixed on the dense foliage, the tools forgotten at our feet. Then, with a grunt, Brian bent down, picked up his chainsaw, and went back to work, leaving me standing there, a sense of awe washing over me. That day, Brian didn't share a story around the campfire. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any words could. And in that silence, I knew we shared a connection, an understanding. We all did.
I'd been keeping watch over the landscape as a seasonal park ranger in Joshua Tree National Park. My job mostly involved overseeing the Jumbo Rocks campground, a relatively quiet region, especially once the desert's chill set in. On this particular night, I was returning home, which was situated at the other end of the park, a drive I had taken countless times before. Usually this journey would be under a veil of darkness with only the distant stars offering their muted glow. But this time a generous moon bathed the park in its cold, luminescent light, making the Eerie desert landscape quite discernible. Driving down Park Boulevard, the road that takes you north through the park, my eyes caught a movement near some Joshua trees by an old fire pit that had long been abandoned. My initial thought, a coyote or maybe a desert fox. They were common in these parts. However, as my eyes adjusted to the peculiar shape, I realized this was no ordinary creature. It was standing upright, a feature distinctly human yet startlingly out of place. The entity was towering, an easy 7 foot tall at least, draped in what seemed to be lengthy, flowing dark hair, encompassing its entire form save for its face. Its face, bathed in the moonlight, held a strangely human characteristic, although it was hard to discern with absolute certainty from my angle and given the flickering moonlight. Its arms were peculiarly slender for such a sizable creature, long, thin, and ending with bony fingers that appeared elongated. I caught sight of it for about 10 seconds as my jeep crawled on, but that fleeting encounter was enough to sow a seed of unease in my gut. I was left questioning my sanity, my perception, and my very understanding of the natural world. What exactly had I witnessed? Once home, my wife was the first person I shared my encounter with. Initially, as expected, she was skeptical, but as I elaborated on what I had seen, she grew thoughtful. She didn't mention terms like chupacabra or mothman. She wasn't one for cryptids or conspiracy theories. Yet she conceded that what I described could indeed be something unexplainable, perhaps even paranormal. For a long while, I struggled to accept this interpretation. Then, a few weeks later, something happened that shook me even further. It was another late night, just like the one before. I was finishing up a routine patrol, the desert cold biting through my parka. The familiar drive back home was in progress, the full moon once again casting long, stretching shadows on the landscape. I was on high alert, half expecting to see that strange figure again, when something else entirely occurred. Right on the edge of the Barker Dam, I spotted a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. This time I knew it wasn't the same creature I'd seen. This figure was smaller, more humanoid, and its movements were more deliberate. As I slowed down my vehicle, I could make out more details. It was a woman, thin, tall, and wrapped in layers of torn, dirty clothing. Her hair was matted, the color indistinguishable in the moonlight, but it was her eyes that caught my attention. Wide, full of fear and desperation, they stared at me unblinkingly from a face smeared with dirt and what seemed like dried blood. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped out of my vehicle, keeping my gaze fixed on her. But as soon as I approached, she vanished, almost as if she was swallowed by the shadows. I stood there, in the middle of the road, feeling the icy wind whip around me as the unsettling echo of her presence lingered in the air. The very next night, as the desert once again succumbed to the silvery shroud of moonlight, I saw her again. It was during my usual patrol round, the familiarity of my daily routine now tainted with an edge of apprehension and anticipation. The Barker Dam, the very place I had spotted her last, loomed ahead in the dim light. As if guided by an unseen force, my eyes strayed towards the same spot. There she was, standing as she had been the night before. The woman, thin and tall, her dirty, ragged clothing billowing slightly in the night wind. She seemed to be waiting, her wide, fearful eyes fixed on my approaching vehicle. I stopped the vehicle at a distance this time, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. I wasn't prepared for another vanishing act. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the vehicle and began to approach her cautiously. Yet as I neared, she didn't disappear into the darkness. She just stood there watching me. I tried to communicate, to ask who she was, what she was doing out here in the middle of the night, but she only responded with silence. Her lips moved as if she was trying to form words, but no sound came. Her gaze, full of inexplicable sadness, bore into me. Upon returning home, I shared the encounter with my wife. The fear in her eyes mirrored my own, yet she was adamant about me going back, helping this woman. Maybe she's in trouble, she suggested. Maybe she needs us. That night, sleep was elusive. Images of the woman under the moonlight haunted my thoughts. The park, my workplace, had turned into a cryptic enigma, revealing secrets that I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. But one thing was certain. I couldn't ignore the woman. The following day, I'd set out with the resolve to help her, to get to the bottom of the mysteries unfolding in Joshua Tree National Park. The following day, I was back at Barker Dam, this time just as dusk fell. It was earlier than my usual rounds, but the anticipation was gnawing at me. I was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery woman's appearance. Perhaps she was lost, or in danger, or perhaps she was connected to the strange creature I had seen weeks prior. As I drove up the familiar path, I saw her again. Just as before, she was standing near the dam, her thin form almost blending into the shadows. This time, however, she wasn't alone. A smaller figure, presumably a child, clung to her side. My heart raced as I stepped out of the vehicle. I called out to them, my voice echoing in the desolate landscape. Much like the previous night, she didn't reply. But she didn't disappear either. She seemed to understand me but couldn't, or perhaps wouldn't, communicate verbally. Her eyes told a story, one of fear, desperation, and a plea for help. The child next to her mirrored her silence, looking at me with wide, curious eyes, clinging tightly to her hand. The following weeks turned into a pattern of silent meetings. I would bring food and water, leaving them at a distance for her and the child. I contacted the local authorities, but they found no missing persons reports that matched their descriptions. My wife, as supportive as ever, suggested we get in touch with an anthropologist friend of hers who had experience with indigenous tribes. The woman and the child, she suggested, might belong to a hidden community that had somehow stayed under the radar. The anthropologist was intrigued and agreed to help. Over the next few weeks, we tried to communicate with the woman, to understand her story. Yet, she remained as enigmatic as the park itself, an entity coexisting in our world but never truly a part of it. Despite the unanswered questions and the mystery, there was a strange comfort in these encounters. They were a reminder that the park held secrets, stories that perhaps were not meant to be unveiled. Yet we were a part of that story now, and so we continued day after day, ensuring the woman and the child were safe, while respecting the unspoken boundaries they had set. And as for the creature I had initially encountered, it never appeared again. Well, I should say it has not yet appeared again. Yet the woman and the child were a constant, their silent presence an enduring mystery in the vast, whispering expanse of Joshua Tree National Park.
That's all for now. However, we extend an invitation, wrapped in the cloak of intrigue, for you to join us as we journey into realms of deliciously spine-chilling exploits. So, if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, please subscribe now. Thanks and see you next time.